GTA, one of the few franchises in existence where the main cast of characters, but most importantly the main protagonist of each game, is just a straight menace of a supervillain, even if you don't count every rampage done in the open world. So I studied every protagonist from the 3D to the HD era to find out who is truly the most evil one of them all. The rules are simple. Based on every action that the character has done in the main story missions and in the side missions of the game, we rank them from pure evil, reserved for the most repulsive and disturbing characters, going down to evil, very bad, bad, not bad, and just straight up good. What's really important though is that any of the implied actions and crimes mentioned in the dialogues will also count here, because a lot of these guys have really messed up backstories that we never get to see on screen. So buckle up, because it's about to get really dark. Right off the bat, we have an extremely problematic yet interesting character, Claude, the main protagonist of GTA 3, which began the 3D era of GTA games. Of all the protagonists in GTA, Claude is often seen as the most one-dimensional character, almost having no nuance in his personality, actions, or motivations. And honestly, that makes him all the more terrifying, because there is no limit to what this guy would do to exact his quest for revenge. You see, Claude was actually living a very happy life with his girlfriend Catalina, traveling across the country and robbing banks along the way. But that's until they got to Liberty City, where during a massive heist, Claude is shot and betrayed by the love of his life and gets left to die because she thought that she was too ambitious for a small-time criminal like Claude.
Sorry, babe. I'm an ambitious girl. You're just small-time.
Little did she know though, I was controlling this mother trucker, and I'm pretty ambitious. This is what began his quest to rise in the ranks of Liberty City's criminal underground, so he could find Catalina at all costs and destroy her life. To get there though, Claude takes out multiple dealers, he terminates a few PIMPs, takes out a few of his bosses and associates, eliminates 3 triad warlords, looks after a mob boss's girl, and joins the Yakuza, after which he also betrays the Yakuza and eliminates one of his bosses. He then takes a man from prison, provokes an entire gang war, and after all is said and done, he finally gets the chance to confront his ex-girlfriend and officer as well, in game. Breakups, am I right? Don't you worry though, this is not over yet, because I have yet to tell you about some of the most deplorable actions that this man has done. Because GTA protagonists are all criminals, alright? They wipe out cops, they steal cars, they put down gang members, but you know what they don't all do? Agree to a job where you snatch innocent people so that they can be turned into dog food at a dog food factory. And no, I didn't make that up.
Turns out my wife was seeing some guy I owe money to. He's got real angry, and he's looking for payback. I've agreed to see him. He thinks I'm gonna pay him off, but my guess is Liberty's dogs are gonna get yet another flavor this month.
Oh no. And just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, he also decides to randomly take out his new love interest at the end of the game, simply because she was talking too much and being a little annoying.
Fucking nail, and my hair is ruined. I mean, can you believe it? This one cost me $50.
But what really adds up to his terrifying lack of sympathy and remorse is that the character is completely mute throughout the whole game, showing zero emotions whatsoever and simply nodding and agreeing to anyone who comes up to him with an odd job that would end up costing the lives of many. With a body count of about 400 people and what is clearly a psychopathic personality, Claude easily earns the evil tier on this list, but as shocking as it may seem, he's not even close to being the worst protagonist in GTA, as shit's about to get so much worse. Moving on to Tommy Vercetti, one of the most iconic characters in the series who this time around can actually talk. This ambitious career criminal was born in Liberty City in 1951 and was actually a family man, helping his dad run a printing shop, all while being influenced by his buddy Sonny Forelli to commit crimes for some quick bucks. And fast forward a few years, Sonny is now his boss, and while Tommy's doing a run-of-the-mill assassination job, he gets ambushed by 11 men and is forced to kill all of them, dubbing him the Harwood Butcher by the Liberty City press. And after serving 15 years in prison, he gets sent to Vice City by Sonny because Tommy was too recognizable.
When I see him walking down the streets of their neighborhoods, it will be bad for business.
And once there, he gets ambushed again during a substance deal, which begins a whole string of events that pushes Tommy to not only eliminate about 500 people, but do a very varied assortment of crimes, like intimidating jurors, stealing missile technology to help a guy named Juan Cortez, and ending the life of a few mob bosses, all while doing some side quests where he helps out with a few illegal businesses in real estate, gun running, and assassinations. The one crime that concerns me the most though is how he committed terrorism by blowing up a mall that we sorta suppose was already evacuated, but these guys are criminals, so I doubt that they did such a clean job at evacuating. but that's up to you to decide. But what I can guarantee you he did is kill a few military personnel in game, and not to mention that he also kills his childhood friend Sonny after being betrayed. Now in a perfect world, Tommy's undeniably fire sense of fashion would cancel out all of his bad deeds, but we're not that forgiving yet in this society. And because most of Tommy's actions were either acts of revenge or made out of self-interest and personal gain, I'd say that he's kind of an asshole, but not quite as deplorable as Claude. So he's going to be in the bad ranking because, you know, he's like your average Vice City mob boss. Now, a lot of you might not know about Victor Vance, who was the main protagonist of GTA Vice City Stories, a game that came out in 2006 and was initially meant to be a PSP exclusive, which later got ported to the PS2. But despite the lack of its popularity, I still think it has one of the most compelling stories for a GTA protagonist so far. You see, Victor Vance is one of, if not the only character in GTA where his past before the events of the game had zero involvement with crime or any sort of violent and immoral activities. However, after Victor's young brother Pete starts suffering from severe asthma, he's forced to join the army just so he can make some money to pay for his brother's treatment. But with that also comes a tragic tale, as his superior Jerry Martinez is not a great man, and because he knows that Victor is desperate for money, he tells Vic that he can make some extra money on the side by doing some odd jobs here and there. And by some odd jobs, he basically meant picking up and transporting lots and lots of substances. What could go wrong there, right? Well, in good GTA fashion, one of those odd jobs ends up going south and the army finds out about it.
Bro Vance, would you care to explain why there's hidden under your bed? And who the Sam Hill is this?
Hey, buddy. Listen, I charge more for groups.
You brought a onto the base? Have you no shame, boy? Are you a moron? Is that it?
But then Vic is the one who's used as an scapegoat by Martinez, which leads to Vic getting kicked out of the army and leaving him at a point where he has no choice but to embrace the Vice City criminal lifestyle. And I gotta say, apart from your average shooting, snatching, and stealing, Vic doesn't really do much else, with his worst crime being that he basically becomes a power-hungry mob boss and starts running his own crime family in Vice City, and then he eventually just kind of dies. And of all the characters in the list so far, I feel like Victor is the only one that I can just call a good guy, because he just wanted to save his brother and ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time and got influenced by the worst people possible. So, he's a good guy. Carl Johnson, the victim of many memes, but also the protagonist of the by far longest GTA game ever, made with over 100 main story missions, taking about 40 to 50 hours to beat. And one thing that you should know about Carl is that he really makes those hours count, because oh boy does he love committing acts of evil. For the uninitiated, Carl was the son of absentee father and his loving mother Beverly Johnson. He grew up with 3 siblings, Sean, Kendall, and Brian, with Sean being the man of the house and the guy who essentially made Carl's childhood kind of miserable and made his adult life even more miserable by influencing to become a gangbanger on Grove Street. But in 1987, something terrible happens because Carl's brother Brian dies at the height of Grove Street's power in Los Santos. And his death gets blamed on Carl by the rest of his family, so he leaves Grove Street to live in Liberty City, because apparently the GTA universe only has 3 states. Unfortunately for Carl though, his mom becomes a victim of a drive-by shooting 5 years later, so he returns to Grove Street to mourn her death, which leads him to rejoin the gang in Grove Street. At first glance, Carl comes off as a level-headed guy who cares a lot about his friends and his family, but that's about where it all ends, because aside from that, he is nothing short of a monster. Because yes, he cares about his family, but it's to such an extreme degree that you just wish he just cared a little less. For example, he buries a guy alive while he's already swimming in his own poop while being stuck in a bathroom stall. All because the guy flirted with his sister and he needed to protect his sister's integrity. And like, you could've, I don't know, beat the guy up or something? That seems a little extreme. And unfortunately for his victims, his strangely violent behavior doesn't stop there, because he also has a track record of causing casualties and taking out the innocent in order to achieve his goals. Like that one time he drowned some innocent lady because he wanted to eliminate Mad Dog's manager, or when he steals Mad Dog's rhyme book, which causes him to become literally depressed.
I don't give a no more. My manager got killed, some asshole stole my rhyme book. Shit is rough.
I think CJ, more than anyone else on this list, has a very extreme way of dealing with his problems, like when he ran over and shredded a bunch of farmers just to steal a combine harvester, with the epitome of his extreme actions being when he capped a few reporters towards the end of the game, which incited a huge riot across the entirety of Los Santos, most likely causing tons of property damage, deaths, injuries to civilians, and a bunch of other shit that I can't even think of. Not to mention the multiple counts of treason that he committed when he snuck into multiple military bases such as Area 69 just to steal a jetpack. And with what is likely the highest body count so far at 734 and some really hard acts to defend, I can confidently put CJ on the very bad tier. I already want to put Niko in the good tier because holy shit, his theme song is so fucking goated. But I'm not gonna let that kind of bias affect this video's integrity. Born in Yugoslavia, Niko Bellic had an abusive father and a loving mother who wished that her son didn't grow in such a harsh environment. And when I say harsh, I mean harsh. Like, he didn't even have electricity until he was 12 years old, and only a year or two later he was forced to join the army with his brother as teenage soldiers, where he not only goes to the Yugoslav wars, but he also has to see his brother die. As you can guess, this completely messed up Niko as a person, and he doesn't really hide the fact that he suffers from emotional detachment, depression, and severe regret. But even then, his life kept getting worse because once he's an adult soldier, he's commanding a unit of 15 men, and one day he gets ambushed by the enemy, leaving everyone dead except him and two other guys named Darko and Florian. This tragic event begins Niko's lifelong quest to find out which one of these two guys could have sold his unit's location to the enemy.
Wonderful! You're here on some revenge mission for something that happened 10 years ago, and you don't care whose life you ruin anyway.
No. Once out of the army though, Niko joins the European criminal underworld for 10 whole years, after which he decides to escape Europe without telling his boss and hops on a ship on the way to Liberty City. And the rest is history.
Niko, it's Roman.
Hello?
Let's go bowling.
Niko's new life in Liberty City unfortunately is not one of honesty and principled work, because he almost immediately joins the Russian mafia, where he commits multiple murders, and then he leaves because he finds out that the mafia has some connections to his old boss all the way in Europe. So what do you think that he does instead? Because if your first guess was hitman for hire, then you would be dead on target. And in this phase of his life, he shamelessly eliminates a few dozen people just to get some money, and then gets blackmailed by a government agency to commit some more crimes and robs a few places as well. At the end of the game though, it is assumed that Niko is leaving the life of crime behind because he wants to stay closer to his friends and family. A noble idea that's never really well executed by any of the GTA protagonists up until this point. And if you look at the story so far, Niko seems very tame, and you could put him pretty low on the list while ignoring his banger theme song. But there's still a piece of the puzzle that I've kept till the very end that truly reveals how evil this guy was. Niko fought in a war against his own will for a good part of a decade, where he mentions that he's committed atrocities.
When the war came, I did bad things. And after the war, I thought nothing of doing bad things.
Based on the real-life history of the Yugoslav war, it is safe to assume that he's taken part in some literal war crimes that can be anywhere along the range of crimes against humanity, massacres, and some pretty messed up stuff that I don't even feel comfortable saying out loud, not just on this platform, but in general. It was pretty terrible. If that wasn't bad enough though, once he leaves the army, he begins working in the European criminal underground, and the crimes he commits aren't just your average GTA hitman style or dealing or car thieving. No. It's so much worse, because Niko himself reveals that he took part in trafficking, which in my opinion is one of the most deplorable things that someone can do. Although a lot of what Niko does is a direct consequence of his terrible upbringing, and despite his willingness to be a better person and quit his life of crime, it still cannot undo the terrible things that he's done in the past. You can, however, still argue that he's seeking redemption, and that at some points in his life he's probably had no choice but to commit these crimes, especially when he was a teen. And I believe that intention matters a lot, so this was a very hard one to do, but I think I'm gonna put him in very bad, just ahead of CJ. And listen, before we move on to the next character, feel free to give me your honest opinions on the video so far, and subscribe to me so you see the next video, because I'd really appreciate it. It's time for a switch in tone, because we're leaving Eastern Europe to learn a bit more about a Liberty City biker. In all honesty though, Johnny's story is just one of pure tragedy, highlighted best by the way that it all ends in GTA 5 as he gets his head crushed by Trevor, essentially being treated as a joke character despite previously being a protagonist in the series. He was famously the vice president of the Lost MC, which he had joined as a young man when he was just 20 years old, and after the gang's president Billy gets arrested for substance distribution, Johnny becomes the interim president of the gang and runs it better than anyone has to date. You see, the old president Billy was kind of a wild dude and he mostly liked to party, and he had a tendency not to get along very well with the other biker gangs in town. And Johnny, on the other hand, was the complete opposite, actually being diplomatic and thinking of the gang as a business that he wanted to grow.
One word. Business. The business that pays his lawyers' fees. The business that puts food on all of our tables. The business that we are all in while you're out pretending to be saved.
Going as far as managing to reach a truce with the other rival gangs during Billy's absence. And whether you agree or disagree with Johnny's leadership, one thing was clear as day. His loyalty to the Lost MC was unmatched by any other member of the gang, and he would do anything to protect it. Anything. Including wiping out multiple people in acts of revenge, selling and consuming substances, and stealing vehicles. Unfortunately for him though, he wasn't as level-headed in his personal life as he was while running the gang, with his biggest problem being his loyalty to his ex-girlfriend Ashley, who constantly cheated on him and encouraged him to consume substances. He even had to snatch Niko's cousin at some point in order to protect Ashley, and ultimately, she ended up being the one who landed him under Trevor's mighty boots, simply because he got hooked on whatever she got hooked on and became weak and sloppy as a leader.
I always kind of liked Johnny K.
He was a man past his prime. I heard he used to be serious. But before that, I mean, back in Alderney.
Man was weak for Crystal, weak for Ashley, man was weak. Shouldn't have spoken to me like that.
He shouldn't have.
I think at the end of the day, Johnny's a terrible criminal, but on the overall GTA scale, he doesn't really seem as bad as the rest of his peers. Unlike Vic though, he doesn't necessarily get pushed into a life of crime against his own will, and most of what he did was very deliberate and calculated with the goal of making money and gaining power. So I'd say he's just bad. Luis Fernando Lopez. I mispronounced his name throughout the whole video, so please forgive me. Probably the only GTA protagonist that would make it onto my dream blunt rotation. Luis grew up in Liberty City and was raised alongside his mother and the rest of his Dominican family. Despite trying to make it as a rapper in his younger years, he still managed to get pulled into the life of crime by his friends and went to juvie at the age of 17. I will say though, I'd consider what he did to end up in juvie not that evil, because it turns out that a teacher was being inappropriate with his sister, so he shot the guy without really putting an end to him, and this actually never even made it onto his record, so, you know, forgiven, at least from me. He also went to prison not long after getting out of juvie for committing Grand Theft Auto, sort of being your run-of-the-mill criminal without nothing major under his name. But all of that changed in 2005 when he met a man with the name of Tony Prince. At first he was only Tony's bodyguard, but soon they started hitting it off really well, becoming best friends and then business partners. This led to Luis having a very nice salary and living a playboy lifestyle, surrounded by all types of luxury that you'd expect a nightclub owner to be surrounded by. But all it took was 3 more years and many unpaid loans taken from loan sharks for Luis to start committing some pretty terrible crimes in order to protect Tony's businesses. He partook in various shootouts, dealing and transportation of substances, removal of LCPD officers, and car thefts. But most importantly, he committed the ultimate crime of having a small wiener. A very well-known fact about him due to how many girlfriends he had since he began working for Tony. Overall though, whenever he did harm anyone, it was usually a pretty bad person, and if it was up to him, he probably wouldn't have committed any of these crimes because he's a man of class, and he just wants to hang out with Tony. So as far as my opinion is concerned, I'm putting Luis in the good tier. I honestly wanted to skip past this guy because the gameplay looks like this. But to keep it short, Huang Li from Chinatown Wars is just sort of your average mafia goon who doesn't really like the feds, you know, as you can guess. And with no crazy redeeming qualities about him, I'm gonna put him in the bad tier. I do know about GTA Advance, but I couldn't care less about that game because now's the time that we move on to the GTA 5 trio, starting with... I don't know about you guys, but I always viewed Franklin as the main protagonist of GTA 5, sort of like this innocent guy who gets influenced by two bank robbers to do some pretty heinous stuff. Franklin was born and raised in Los Santos and experienced a very traumatic childhood as his single mother passed away due to a severe substance addiction that she developed as a response to her boyfriend's abusive tendencies. Because of this, Franklin mostly lived with his grandparents at a very young age, and he really only became a gangbanger after the death of his grandparents, and he got expelled from high school for assaulting a teacher. And with Lamar Davis on his side, he starts stealing dope, jacking cars, and robbing small banks, a lifestyle that doesn't last very long because he gets arrested at the age of 20 and is sent to prison where he decides to leave the criminal life behind and do some real work. But spoiler alert, he's a playable character in GTA, so you can imagine how that phase of his life didn't last any longer than Louis did in bed. And not so long after being released, he began working for Simeon, who would ask him and Lamar to repossess cars from clients who couldn't afford their monthly payments. A job that leads him to Michael, with the rest of the story being obvious because I know you guys have already played the game at least 2 or 3 times on different consoles, so I'm not going to retell the whole story. But what's interesting about Franklin is that he didn't feel inconvenienced by Michael. Instead, he sort of looked up to him and had dreams of one day getting to his level and being a respected person who pulls massive jobs like Michael did in his past. He wasn't trying to get away from Michael and the problems that surrounded the middle-aged criminal. No. He honestly kind of embraced it. On his side of GTA 5's story, he committed an assortment of terrible crimes. For example, he offed a dozen of gangbangers, offed a lot of innocent cops, stole military items from the feds, robbed the banks, and of course, he had a yee-ass haircut. But once that's all said and done, within the context of GTA 5, he was just an ambitious 20-something-year-old who wanted to make something of his life. He didn't take the most ethical approach, but honestly, he didn't do anything that's super disturbing or chaotic, so in my eyes, he's just not that bad. The retired bank robber Michael DeSanta is not a great human being. Often known for being a liar, a hypocrite, and honestly just being a selfish criminal with nearly zero integrity or loyalty. Much like Franklin, Michael had a very rough upbringing, growing up in a trailer park with his abusive father who abandoned him and his mother. But despite all of the odds, Michael still managed to become a very talented football player in high school, even landing him a quarterback position for an all-state football team. But that didn't last too long because injuries forced him to quit. And because of his new lack of purpose and his sad upbringing, Michael unfortunately began a life of crime, ending up in prison twice by the age of 20, and surrounded himself with Lester and Trevor Philips, who became his #1 partner. And around this time, he even met his now wife Amanda, who was an adult entertainer at the time. I think it's really past this point in Michael's story where his life just kind of goes downhill and he becomes more and more deplorable based on all the actions and the bad things that he's about to do. Because Michael being Michael, he starts thinking that he's all about that family life and that he doesn't want to rob banks anymore. And at the same time, Trevor and his partner Brad were telling him that he's going soft. So Michael decides that his only way out of this is to backstab both of his partners and move into Hollywood. And you know the rest. He made himself an asset of the FIB, tried to have an agent kill Trevor and fake his own death. But the plan goes south and Brad gets shot while Trevor escapes, thinking that both of his best friends had just died. And even though Michael didn't really like Brad to begin with, this is just a new low even for a criminal. Worst part of it all is that it turned out that he didn't even really care about having a family, constantly drinking, being a bad father, and complaining that his life has no purpose, with both him and his wife cheating on each other on a few occasions. Based on how people talk about Michael online, I also don't think people realize how ruthless Michael really is, because aside all the cops that he obviously takes down, he brought down a full jet of people using a sniper, broke into 2 separate federal buildings, stole classified government property and vehicles, committed espionage and treason against the country, and took out many military personnel and government personnel. I think all of these actions could have felt a little less evil if he actually showed a bit of remorse, but everything he does is for very selfish and narcissistic reasons, which honestly reminds me of Franklin's mentality more than anyone else's, especially if you choose the ending where Franklin drops Michael. But as opposed to Franklin, he's had a lot more time to try to repent for his actions and at least feel a little bit of remorse for the people that he's hurt, but he's still in his 50s making the same mistakes he was making in his 20s, so I guess I gotta put him in the bad tier right next to Tommy. I bet you thought I missed him, didn't you? Tony's a very important character for this list because between him and Trevor, I have a very hard time deciding which one is more of an asshole. Tony Cipriani was a side character in GTA 3 whose younger, slightly slimmer self became a playable character in the PSP title GTA Liberty City Stories. Similar to I think every single guy that I mentioned in this list, Tony has a very dysfunctional family, with his dad dying due to gang violence when he was only a kid and his mom despising him ever since he was a child because she never thought that he'd grow up to live up to his dad's name.
Ma! Ma! Come on, Ma, speak to me!
And to emphasize just how much she hated him, she goes on to put a hit on her own son just so he could, I guess, die like a real man. At least that was her explanation. And she was so deranged that it's the only time I ever felt bad for Tony, because the things that this man does in this game are horrifying.
I called a hit on you. It's really the only way for you.
What? Ma?
You were always a disobedient fool. It's for the best, son. At least try to die like a real man. Try to stop shaming me.
Tony doesn't have a noble reason behind why he works for the mob. He sort of just does it so that he can rise to a high enough rank so that his mom believes that he's as good as his dad. And this leads him to eliminate hundreds of rival gangsters, using a minigun to take out mafia members, committing deplorable actions, and even neutralizing the city's mayor in the game. But that's only about a quarter of the horrendous shit that he does in this game, because it gets so much worse. Because in a side mission in the game that's available for you, the player, you partake in some sort of game where you film yourself using a chainsaw to dispatch of homeless people and various other participants that most definitely weren't there by choice. Tony not only shows no remorse, the guy practically goes out of his way to partake in this kind of activity. But don't worry, it gets worse, because at some point in the story, you meet this guy named Donald Love, some real estate tycoon who also happens to be working with the mob on a regular basis. So under his command, Tony goes to Fort Staunton, or whatever. It's a parody of Staten Island. And he plants bombs all over while eliminating any innocent construction worker that was nearby so that he leaves no witnesses. But if that wasn't bad enough, he blows up the entire freaking place without any sort of evacuation, wiping a whole portion of the island clean, possibly taking down thousands of people. Like, why? Because Donald Love wanted to reduce the price of the land so he could come and buy everything. This man committed one of the most atrocious acts in video game history just so his boss, not even himself, could buy some land for cheaper. Tony Cipriani is a remorseless monster of a human being, and nothing would ever come close to redeeming his actions in this game. But it's time we see how he actually compares to Alright, it's now time to look into everyone's favorite Canadian psychomaniac, Trevor Philips. And this man is by far the most unpredictable, unstable character that we've covered in this series. So you can bet that this man is not going to be placed anywhere near the good ranking, not even close. Out of everyone in the GTA franchise, Trevor has likely had the darkest and most traumatizing childhood, with having both an abusive mom and an abusive dad who never really understood him and neglected him due to his violent tendencies. He claims to have his hockey coach with a hockey stick as a kid because the coach didn't want him to play, and he strangled a clarinet player with his own instrument at school, as well as hurting and wiping out various animals when he was a little kid. At some point, he was even abandoned in a shopping mall by his own dad, and in retaliation, he burned down the entire place. And there is even some slight implication that he might have taken out his own biological brother, but I won't be reading too deep into theories and speculations to decide this ranking, so let's move on to the events of GTA 5. Much like Trevor's personality, his crimes throughout the entire game are kind of all over the place, while also being extremely deprived and at times twisted. For beginners, he robbed quite a few banks with Michael all the way before the story of GTA 5 even starts, and he rarely ever hesitates before taking the life of an innocent officer and against civilians. And after the failed bank robbery where Brad dies, he decides to start a crime empire in San Andreas. But worse than that, he found his new partners through really bad bullying and manipulation. Especially with how he convinced Ron to get out of his happy 12-year marriage so that he could end up living to his full potential. Or even worse, how he offed all of Wade's friends without telling Wade about it, just so that the two of them could work together. We don't really have to go through the whole Johnny situation, but he did completely massacre the entirety of Johnny's crew when they were spending time with their families inside of their trailers in a fit of rage, and extensively abused one of his friends, Floyd, for no reason, not to mention that it's somewhat implied that he does some pretty inappropriate stuff with them. But by far, what I really think makes his character even more disturbing is that he casually eats a human stew at some point in the story, and you can see him shoving a foot down a toilet in one of his character switch animations. Not to mention that he's a Canadian.
Canadians? The worst. The absolute worst. Worse than the...
Much like Tony, Trevor almost has no redeeming characteristics, with some people claiming that he's got loyalty to his partners, but he's too unstable for that to be considered a good, valid point. So ultimately, I'm gonna put him on top of the evil tier, and Tony gets the crown for being the most evil protagonist in GTA.